Welcome to the Filson Historical Society's Gertrude Polk Brown Lecture. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Ann E. Marshall to Louisville. Dr. Marshall is an associate professor of history at Mississippi State University. However, she is no stranger to our Commonwealth of Kentucky. She received her BA in history from Centre College before going on to receive her MA and PhD in history at the University of Georgia. In addition to her role at Mississippi State, she has served as the executive director of the U.S. Grant Association and the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library since March of 2022. And with that, please join me with a warm Filson welcome for Patrick Lewis and our honored guest, Ann Marshall.
Well, thanks, Angela, for the wonderful introduction, and welcome back to the Commonwealth.
Thank you. I always love to come back home. So.
Absolutely. Well, and let's start with home and regionalism. I think the thing that you do so well in this book with Cassius Clay is what you did in your first book, is deconstructing these easy regional binaries of North and South. How did you use this figure as a wedge to get inside those assumptions?
Yeah, so I teach a lot of Southern history at Mississippi State University, and I always try to remind my students that there are many Souths, and I think you can really see that. Of course, I learned that growing up in Kentucky, and when you study Kentucky history, you see a lot of that. And I think that, Cassius Clay doesn't really become Cassius Clay in any other part of the South, really. There's only, a stretch of sort of border, what we call border South, where I think he could have both been a slaveholder, but developed a very cogent critique of slavery because of the way he saw slavery work in his society. And I don't think he would have been allowed to operate. I mean, he was barely allowed to operate. That's why he had to carry around all those Bowie knives. I don't think he would have literally survived in an area of the South that had been even more committed to slavery than the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So, yeah.
Absolutely, and I think, we start the book, like almost any biography, we go back a couple of generations, and that allows you to take this biographical arc from the earliest moments, pre-statehood, and all the way through. What about Clay's family origins and this legacy of enslavement that he never quite can shake?
Right. So, yes, his father comes over from Virginia, and his father was named Green Clay, and he came over from Virginia in 1780, comes when it's still very much Indian territory, and moves into Estill Station, and he was the 11th child in a prominent family in Virginia, but if you were the 11th child of any family, you weren't going to get much of that inheritance. And so he has to make it on his own, and he becomes a surveyor. And in a time when people did not have much cash, the way that surveyors would get paid was by land. And so he worked for years and amassed thousands and thousands of acres of very prime bluegrass land. But in order to make that land productive, he needed tenants, and he also needed enslaved laborers. And so he ends up purchasing many individuals and enslaving them. And so by the time that he dies in the late 1820s, he owns over 100 men and women. And so he's very much part of the story of, in one way we can see it as this American success story, but he does it very much on the backs of these enslaved individuals.
And so after Green passes, then, this legacy of enslavement goes down a generation. And we focus on a couple of main characters in the family, both Cassius, of course, but then his brother Brutus. How do they both sort of live uncomfortably or maybe comfortably inside this legacy that Greene had built?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. He, Greene constructs this will that's really fascinating, and not just for the attorneys out there in the room, but that this will was meant to, and it really reflected the way that a lot of large slaveholders viewed their human holdings, unfortunately, and that they saw them as this source of generational wealth. And they meant for their families to own them for many decades to come. And so he constructed this will so that, his sons could own certain slaves outright, but then others were entrusted for future generations. They owned some of them for their sisters because women weren't allowed to own property. Once they were married, they turned it all over to their husbands. And so he constructed this very elaborate will that really tried to ensure that these enslaved individuals would stay within the family for many years. And this actually really circumscribed Cassius's ability later on to manumit them. Now, whether he would have done that anyway is up for grabs, but it really did sort of shape the way that his career went.
Mm-hmm. And I think, reading the book, we see that Cassius is maybe one of those people when it comes to managing an estate and wealth that all of these lawyers are afraid of in setting up these elaborate trusts. Yet, again, his brother Brutus time and time again comes in and sort of bails him out. And quite honestly, Mary Jane is the one with all the sense in the family, it seems.
Yes. Cassius was terrible with money. Fortunately for him, he had a brother who was much more responsible and less impulsive, and so his name was Brutus Clay, and he lived in Bourbon County, and he was a committed slaveholder. And so it's very interesting to look at their relationship, because despite the fact that Cassius was sort of arguing against this institution on which all their wealth was based, and that he was constantly in financial trouble, Brutus bailed him out again and again. And so it's a really interesting sort of familial story. I think we can maybe all relate to, having to go to Thanksgiving and having uncomfortable conversations around the family table. And, I do wonder, there's the wonderful letters between the two of them that you can see a lot of this tension, but I bet the dinner table conversations were even better. And I wish I'd been a fly on the wall for those. So.
Well, and you've mentioned packing around Bowie knives, and Cassius, as you say, emerges from this world of frontier violence that gets this very thin veneer of gentility. How does this violent tendency that we see when his abolitionist politics are out in public, but that manifests real early? So what are some of the early indications of that temperament?
Yes, well, a big one just happened 2 blocks down the road here, right before Cassius was set to get married to Mary Jane Warfield. There was a letter that her mother produced that had come from a man named John de Clary, a physician, who had once been Mary Jane's suitor. And it disparaged Clay's reputation. And we don't know the particulars of what it said, but as Clay later said, it should have been thrown into the fire and not shown to him. Well, once it was shown to him as a Kentuckian of a certain class at a certain time, he had to confront John de Clary. So, just days before the wedding, he sets off from Lexington to Louisville to go confront him, finds him at the Galt House, because who was not at the Galt House back in the 1820s and 30s, right? And he canes him in the middle of the street. Yes, and so de Clary, of course, has been publicly humiliated, and this ends in a challenge to a duel. Clay shows up for the duel, but Declary's there. They decide they can't duel because there's too many people around, so they decide to reconvene in Indiana because, of course, when you don't want to, when Louisville won't do, you got to go over to Indiana to have your duel. So he goes over to Indiana the next day, and Declary's not there. So he hightails it back to Lexington to get married, and then comes back, though, because his honor has not been satisfied. So then he finds out that Declary has been so shamed that he had slit his wrists and died. So this was the start to the Clay marriage. So it was a sure sign to Mary Jane of the drama that would ensue in the rest of the marriage, I think. So,
to say the least.
Yes.
So as a young man, it seems that Cassius is really in the mold of your Southern plantation gentleman. What changes for him?
Yes, so what changes for him is that he goes off to college to Yale. And he writes in his autobiography about seeing William Lloyd Garrison give a talk in 1831. And this would have been right before Garrison launched The Liberator. And so Clay was struck by the fact that people could and did speak out against slavery. And so a lot of people kind of cite this incident as being the moment where he sort of develops this moral conscience about slavery. But actually what he writes more about his time at Yale is the economy that he sees in New England. And he becomes really enamored with this diversified economy that features this sort of small-scale agriculture, which dovetails very nicely with this burgeoning industrial economy that's starting to take shape in New England. And he becomes a convert. And he thinks to himself, there are all these people, there is a middle class here in New England. There's no middle class in Kentucky at the time, so to speak. It's just a sort of oligarchy of slaveholders, and then there are white wage laborers who don't have a fair shot at fair wages or at social mobility, because the slave society is constructed to keep this small sort of group of slaveholders at the top and not really make things very democratic or open for opportunity for your average white Kentuckian. And so he thinks through this, and so this is what he's going to take with him when he goes back to Kentucky, and eventually he doesn't start advocating for this kind of new economic order right away, but it's pretty early on in his political career that this really becomes a sort of bread and butter of his politics.
And then, of course, he becomes infamous probably, for his newspaper, True
Yes.
American. Where does that emerge from?
Yes, so he starts the True American in 1845 because he cannot get a sort of he can't really get a voice. Not surprisingly, he doesn't, he's elected a couple of times to the state legislature, but he becomes very unpopular pretty quickly with the people that count in Kentucky, which were many of whom were slaveholders. And so he decides he really needs a platform in the state to start spreading his economic views. And so he's going to have to start this newspaper himself. And that's what he does in 1845 in Lexington. And he knows that because there have been newspaper editors that run out of Kentucky. For example, James Burney was run out of Danville in the 1830s and had to move to Cincinnati when he tried to start an anti-slavery newspaper. And Elijah Lovejoy was murdered out in Alton, Illinois for his abolitionist newspaper. So Clay knows this is dangerous, and so he arms that newspaper office. He puts up lead panels on the wall. He has Mexican lances. He has 2 4-pounder cannons, and in case none of that works, he has a powder keg. And there's a trap door, so the last person out is supposed to ignite the powder keg and blow the whole place up when the mob comes to get him. So, yeah.
And fortunately, nobody is harmed when the mob does come.
Right, that's right. Well, and they prided themselves on being an orderly mob, and he was homesick in bed, and so he couldn't, thankfully for all involved, he couldn't blow the place up.
But this also then puts him on this national radar for anti-slavery politics. What is his reputation nationally, and is he being misread?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, he develops this national reputation starting in the early 1840s. And all these sort of figures like Salmon Chase, for example, who at the time eventually becomes Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But when Clay meets him, he's an attorney in Cincinnati, and he's working on his own constitutional critique of slavery at the time, and really finds Clay to be fascinating because here he is, this slaveholder in a slaveholding state that has enough moxie to stand up against the powers that be. Similarly, you got Horace Greeley, who's just launched the New York Tribune, who also finds Clay to be fascinating. And so you've got those folks who are really into him. You've got William Lloyd Garrison, who likes that Clay's anti-slavery, but criticizes him for still owning slaves. And then you have a whole slew of pro-slavery Southerners who think he's really frightening because they're afraid that he'll incite a slave rebellion, or he'll actually be listened to by these white laborers of the South who will then challenge the authority of the slaveholders.
And so one of the things that I was really struck by is time and again, he seems to have really, really bad timing decision-making at these really national inflection points. And so as he's gotten this traction, this national platform, the war with Mexico comes, which everyone knows is a war about American expansion, but then also the future of slavery across the continent. And he really does bungle this opportunity and throw away quite a bit. Tell us what happens here.
Yeah. Well, it's really fascinating because Clay had spoken out against this war with Mexico, which he called this, basically a huge land grab by the slaveocracy. And that's really what it was, of course. But he's so unpopular after the downfall of the true American that in order to basically exist, to keep living and functioning and doing business in Kentucky, he decides to enlist to go fight this war because this was an enormously popular war amongst white Kentuckians. And so he does, and essentially goes and becomes the colonel of a regiment, and they go to Mexico and basically don't see a lot of action. But he was out on patrol duty with a contingent of these men, and they basically they're found by some Mexican troops, and one of them takes off running. Well, at that point, the Mexican troops decide that they're going to kill everyone. Well, Clay, in a sort of stereotypically dramatic way, tells these men to lie down flat on the ground, and he opens up his shirt and says, "Don't hurt the men, kill me." And that stops the Mexicans in their tracks, and they take them all prisoners instead. So Clay was a prisoner for most of his time in Mexico, but the gambit to shore up his reputation actually worked. He got all of this great press, even from these Southern newspapers that thought he was kind of the devil beforehand, but because he showed this bravery and this patriotism, and because he, was heroic and prevented his men from being killed, they really bought what he was selling, and so it worked. He salvaged his reputation. Then he comes back to Kentucky and makes people angry all over again, but it worked for a little while. So.
Well, and that is, I think, a really important story about making people angry in Kentucky, because there really is this moment immediately following the war of the state constitutional convention where there is an open conversation about the future of slavery in this state.
Yeah, and that was the Constitutional Convention of 1849, 1850, and yeah, it was this moment where it started out as not being about slavery. It was, that basically they wanted to write some provisions into the state constitution that made the voting rights and county court systems a little more democratic. But it quickly became this kind of referendum on slavery. And the question wasn't really, well, should we get rid of slavery? Because no one believed that they had the constitutional right to do that. But the idea was, could we implement a provision in the Constitution that down the road would allow us to have a popular referendum on slavery? So it's very kind of, down the road kind of thing. And but it launched this full-fledged discussion of slavery that really wasn't seen anywhere, hadn't been seen anywhere since the early 1830s, when the Virginia legislature, in the wake of Nat Turner's revolt, started discussing slavery. And so Clay really is involved in this, although he knows he's never going to be elected as a delegate to the convention. But this is probably where he he gets in this is definitely the most controversial moment of his career, because he ends up getting into a melee outside of nearby his home in Madison County, and ends up disemboweling his opponent. That was rather shocking, even by Kentucky standards.
Well, and I find this national reaction to what seems par for the course for early Kentucky politics is really fascinating. Both the way that it lands with his anti-slavery allies nationally, but also, again, in maybe the way that the war does, the credit that does him for his political opponents, too.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating because, he's in some ways, and using this Bowie knife, right? It's one thing, I mean, dueling was seen as sort of outmoded and reprehensible by a large swath of the American public by the 1830s, 1840s, but knives were a whole other order of things, and they were seen as being incredibly savage and as people back then would have said, uncivilized. And so to have this man who was supposedly a gentleman, right, and supposedly had these high principles, walking around with this small machete that he was using on other human beings was very controversial. And so, it was really, he got a lot of criticism for it, but he pointed out he only used it in defense of him, self-defense. And, it certainly, though, became, the thing that many people associated him with for a century afterwards, still today even, yeah.
So the Constitutional Convention sort of delegate election, you pointed out something really important, this transition from 1840s Clay into the 1850s Clay, where he recognizes that he's probably not going to get elected.
Yeah.
But he is really good at speaking and convincing people of sort of his brand of relatively conservative anti-slavery. So where does he take the show on the road after that?
Yeah, so he ends up becoming, and this is one of the things I think I've focused on in the book more than other people who have written about Clay. And I really argue in the book that by the 1850s, he becomes this national political figure. People always think of him as being this really unique guy from a very unique state. But in the 1850s, he really becomes this national figure and embodies this movement that starts off as being the sort of the free soil movement that morphs into the Republican Party by the mid-1850s. And that's with this notion that, American opportunity can only expand without slavery, that opportunities for white Americans will be stymied with the expansion of slave territory, which of course happens after the war with Mexico and continues to happen throughout the 1850s. And so, he becomes this embodiment really of these free soil principles. And so it's really not a surprise that he becomes this founding member of the Republican Party, and he becomes really useful for political candidates in these more conservative areas of the Midwest, so places like Indiana, Illinois, and so he ends up campaigning for example, in 1858, Lincoln's campaign against Douglas. Clay goes up and campaigns for Lincoln during that period of time. And so really any time that these kind of conservative Republican areas needed an enthralling spokesperson, they would call on Clay.
So jumping ahead a few years into the early 1860s, Clay is the U.S. ambassador to Russia. I don't think anybody, and maybe especially him, would have predicted that path going into the 1860 election. What's on his mind when the conventions start, and how does he end up in Russia?
Right. So Clay actually came in second to Hannibal Hamlin in the contest for the vice presidential nomination in 1860. That was pretty much the pinnacle of his, spoiler alert, that was the pinnacle of his political career. And so he's disappointed, but he thinks he has a chance of getting a cabinet position. He particularly wants to be Secretary of War. Now, put yourself in Abraham Lincoln's shoes. Do you think it's you're trying to keep Southern states from seceding. Do you think it's a very good idea to, enlist a guy who has, defended his newspaper office with cannons and, and Bowie knives? Does that say peacetime to you? Right. So Lincoln, there's no way that Lincoln would have ever done that. So he ends up, but Clay is, he thinks this is his shot now. Finally, he's put in all this work. He actually not only wants the political success, but he also needs some money. And so he keeps asking for these patronage positions. And finally, William Seward tells Lincoln, well, let's give him the ambassadorship to Spain. Well, Clay did not like that at all. He thought Clay was, that Spain was a has-been, and so not important at all. So they said, fine, okay, you can have Russia. So that's what he ends up having to settle for. He regrets it almost immediately. Like he writes Lincoln when he's off the coast of Ireland on the ship on the way over and says, I've made a big mistake. I'd like to come back. Can you give me a military commission? So he won't make it back he stays over there for about 6-7 months before he's able to come back. Mary Jane and the children come back as soon as possible. They thought it was too cold. They moved right back into Whitehall.
Well, I wanted to focus on the family in Russia, and then Cassius sort of going back and remaining there for years now. Russia really does seem to mark a downturn both in Clay's political career, but also a really dark time for him personally and for family relationships.
Yes, so he goes back to Russia because he's back in the States for about 9 months. It's a really interesting time period because he sees the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation come out. He sees the Emancipation Proclamation issued, but right away he's dissatisfied. Lincoln also knows he's not going to make a very good general. He sees some very limited military action, but realizes that if he goes back to Russia, there are some financial benefits to that. And so when he goes back to Russia, he goes back alone without any family. He spends a lot of time, basically working out some deals that do actually make him some money. And he doesn't do a whole lot of diplomacy. Interestingly, this is during this time period. This is, when William Seward arranges, so Clay will be there until 1869. And during this time period, of course, William Seward arranges for the purchase of Russia. Later on, Russia, sorry, that would have been quite the purchase, Alaska. And so Clay later on, takes all kinds of credit for this. And in fact, he says that he wants on his tombstone to have one word, and that word to be Alaska. Well, we can see in the papers of the Foreign Relations of the United States, the letter he writes to Seward saying, congratulations on this. I had no idea that this was in the works. So he had no role in that. So he had a lot of time on his hands, and he got up to, as we would say, no good. He gets embroiled in some scandals so papers intermittently started talking about his bachelor lifestyle. He liked to go to the ballet a lot. And then there was a scandal that erupted over his dealings with a woman that turned out to be a brothel owner. And so this kind of filters back to the United States by 1867, 1868, at which time Mary Jane, who'd been married to him for decades and had put up with an awful lot, decides that this is it. So he increasingly becomes estranged. I think my favorite tidbit from this time period is that Clay started dyeing his hair. He had white hair, and this was in the days before, our Just for Men technology. So hair dye is not what it is today, and so it turned his hair a certain shade of green. And so this got into the newspapers, and so there's a letter he writes back to his oldest daughter, Mary Barr, where he says, my hair is not green, and actually I think that one's in the Filson. So that letter's in the Filson, where he's denying that his hair is green to his older daughter. But yeah, that's not to make light of this, but it turns into it's definitely sort of what happens is a sort of downfall of his nuclear family there.
And so this also marks a moment where, at least in sort of the popular memory of Cassius Clay, his story kind of concludes. But he lives for a long time, and he keeps serving in the diplomatic corps, into the Johnson administration. And it seems that this Republican Party that he was really at home at in the 1850s evolves and changes after Lincoln. And he has a hard time fitting in. Tell us, and maybe drawing on your U.S. Grant Library experience, what have we missed?
Right. And that's, I think, one of the things that's so instructive about following Clay's story, and one of the things that it can really tell us about American history as a whole is why we got freedom, right? Why African Americans gained freedom with the 13th Amendment, citizenship with the 14th, and the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, but why they didn't gain equality, right? I mean, why, if we, in the bird's eye view, if we pull back the lens, why, if we have the 15th Amendment ratified in 1870, do we need the Voting Rights Act almost 100 years later, right? What's the deal? And it's not just, we can just say, oh, well, people were racist. And yeah, that's part of it, certainly. But what Clay shows us is that these fissures, right, these conflicts between values were baked into the very documents that support freedom. In Clay's case, the Constitution, right? So he, for example, is happy about the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, but he's not happy about the way that it's enforced. Then the government has to come in after the war under Ulysses S. Grant. The U.S. military, creates 5 military districts and uses American troops to enforce fair elections, to enforce employment law, and basically make sure that white Southerners abide by these constitutional measures. Without that, they wouldn't have, white Southerners would have, we see what happens at the end of Reconstruction, right, during the Jim Crow era. We wouldn't have had Reconstruction without those measures. But for people like Clay, and it's not just Clay, it's people like Salmon Chase, it's people like Horace Greeley, it's a lot of these very mainstream anti-slavery politicians before the war feel the same way. And so they peel off in 1872. into a breakaway group of Republicans called the Liberal Republicans. That's like a classical liberalism, not like our progressive liberalism today. And they want to get back to basically they don't want this U.S. Army to be running Reconstruction. They want to give back voting rights to these ex-Confederates, even though they're not going to abide by the amendments. And so for them, this constitutionalism and the means by which these amendments are supposed to be reinforced are more important than the ends, right? So it's the principles that to them is more important than the actual execution. And so by looking at Clay, we can see how this spirit of anti-slavery really has limits. It has very real limits because of property rights and because of separation of powers, all things that are these sort of seemingly benign elements of the Constitution that are in our country's very DNA.
That's a really important point. I want to remind folks, if you did pick up a card and you've got questions, we're going to collect those and be able to ask those here in a few minutes, so be writing them down if you haven't been working on those. But I want to turn to legacy building and historical memory, which is a topic that you know very well. I want to move into the 20th century and talk about a couple of very important vectors for Cassius Clay memory. And the first one of those is Judge William Townsend. Why does he matter in this story?
Yeah, so this, and some of you may be familiar with Judge William Townsend, who was a huge collector of Lincolniana. He loved Abraham Lincoln, and he found Cassius Clay while he was writing about Lincoln and just fell in love with Cassius Clay. And he was a very colorful country lawyer. He was so smart, but had that folksy way about him. So people loved that. And he in 1952, he went to the Chicago Civil War Roundtable and gave this enthralling talk. It was over an hour long about Clay's life. He spread all kinds of mythology. He called Clay an abolitionist. Clay was not an abolitionist. He wanted, slavery to end constitutionally. He vastly exaggerated Clay's manumission. He said he gave away all of his enslaved individuals. He focused a lot on the romance with the ballerinas. People were just eating this up, and so that would have been one thing if it had just stayed at the Civil War Roundtable, but they recorded the presentation and they put it on vinyl. It was a 2-record set. And people listened to that. It was sold so well. I always tell my students this, and they're just like, what? People listen to spoken word records? Like, how bored were they, right? But people listened to them, including the future governor of Kentucky, Louis Nunn, who then with his wife Beulah oversaw the restoration of Whitehall. Then he writes an American Heritage article. So it's just all of this mythology spreads about Clay because of William Townsend and his very entertaining, his very entertaining version. And then a lot of other authors who write about Clay take Townsend at his word, right, without even going back to look at the historical documentation. And so we can kind of see how this snowballs out of control. So yeah, there was a lot of mythology to peel away.
And I find this really fascinating that this happens so shortly before we get to the greatest, right?
Yeah.
And then when Muhammad Ali changes his name, all of these legends about Cassius Clay get drugged back up and flung in his face. But Ali remembers some things, his family remembers things that give lie to all of this inflated vision.
Right. And so I'm sure, as you all know, Muhammad Ali, named Cassius Clay, was named after his father, and who was one of many, African-American Kentuckians who had the last name Clay, because there were so many white Kentucky slave owners that a bunch of these people had the last name Clay. And so, when he changes his name in 1964 after joining the Nation of Islam, he gets so much such pushback. And, people just saying, well, this is not your slave name because this guy was an abolitionist. And so in his autobiography in 1975, Muhammad Ali writes about this, and he said that when he was in high school here in Louisville, he had a teacher that kept telling him how great this ancestor of his was. Well, Cassius is not actually his ancestor, but he kept saying, your namesake was so great, you need to go read about him in the library. So Muhammad Ali went to the public library and found this book of speeches that was published in 1848, and he read in the speeches this very sort of racist, bit in one of Cassius Clay's speeches. And so he went and showed it to the teacher, and he said the teacher never talked about Cassius Clay again. So, but this is the kind of thing that people still bring this up. Every once in a while, Cassius Clay will appear in some sort of random Facebook thread or something, and then in the comments section, I'd tell you, like 2/3 of this is about whether or not Muhammad Ali was justified in changing his name. So this is just an ongoing, I write about this in my coda, but that this is the takeaway. But it's really interesting that Muhammad Ali, as he wrote in his autobiography, he said he might have gotten rid of his slaves, but he kept the racism. So.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about research and process. You'd mentioned some letters that came from the Filson. Cassius himself does quite a bit to shape his own legacy towards the end of his life. What did you find? What did you not find? What did you have to struggle to put back together?
Yes, well, one of the things that stymied people who have tried to study Clay is that in 1864, while he was off in Russia and Mary Jane was home at Whitehall, Confederate raiders came through and set fire to one of their barns. And this happened to be where Clay kept all of his, papers, his letters, his expenses, all of that. And so that all burned. And so there's a huge gaping hole in the record here. We do have lots of interesting correspondence with other family members, a lot of which is at the Filson, a fantastic collection there. And I really relied on newspapers a lot to kind of to track, what people were thinking about him and where these, what people in different areas of the country were thinking about him with different political proclivities. And that's really what I relied on because it's really, because he's been so sort of mythologized, you can't rely on a lot of the secondary literature. I mean, there have been some really interesting people that have written about him. In fact, I'd heard that there was the Richard Keel, the guy who played, he was in Goldfinger, he played, what was his name? Anyway, he came to the Filson many years ago. He came to the Filson to do research for his own book on Cassius Clay. So I've read that book, and it's not very factual. It has nothing to do with your documents, though.
It's good to hear.
You can't be blamed. But yes, all that to say, the primary sources are so important when looking at Clay.
Absolutely. Well, and I think too, in thinking about the end of his life, becomes this recluse living alone in Whitehall. It really is the Lion of Whitehall, is this solitary figure they are rambling about alone, and continues these riffs with his children particularly. But they go on and sort of do a lot of really important things despite him. Sort of talk about that end of life legacy and where he sits.
Yeah, so one of the things that also didn't help things is that he was this, old lonely man at the end. It was really interesting because Mary Jane ends up divorcing him after a orphan from Russia shows up at Whitehall that may or may not have been actually, his own child. And she leaves, they get a divorce, and then Mary Jane and 3 of their daughters become huge figures in the suffragist movement. Laura Clay was his daughter, who was probably the most famous for her work in the suffrage movement. So he ends up kind of alone, and then he decides at the age of 84 he wants to marry again. The problem is that he decides he wants to marry his 15-year-old housekeeper, which he does. So cue more, negative commentary in the press. And so she leaves him after a couple of years. And, he sort of dies alone, this kind of very sort of sad existence. So it really was kind of a, inglorious end there. And then, and then his sort of mythology grows from there, so.
It's really fascinating. Well, you've talked a little bit about some of the constitutional issues that he brings up and represents, this changing sort of meaning and focus of the Republican Party, which I think is really critical for us to think about now. I think also more generally, he lets us think about, and you talk quite a bit, about the nature of political coalitions that have to exist in American society, and the sort of the spectrum of opinion around an issue that you have to assemble, but that's not always satisfactory for us. Expand on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important, because I think a lot of people today, we really associate the anti-slavery movement with this sort of moral abolition, right? Like the William Lloyd Garrisons, the Frederick Douglasses, even the crazy John Browns, right? He was acting out of this moral impulse. But the vast majority of Americans who were against slavery, the vast majority of white Americans, were doing it for this more economic purpose, right? And this idea that opportunity should be for everyone, that upward mobility depended on education and access to jobs. And so, that's harder to see. People don't necessarily see that today. And also what they don't understand is that this political anti-slavery movement, which allowed for Lincoln to be elected, which is what pushed the Southerners, many Southern states to secede, really was the result of this kind of fragile political coalition of people who, kind of got together to create this force in this political party. But keeping them together, right, it becomes really hard. I mean, they stay together during the war, and pass a crazy amount of legislation. They get these amendments passed, but then once the war's over, once they're done trying to curb Andrew Johnson's influence during his presidency, then the coalition kind of falls apart over these issues of, how are we going to reinforce these amendments? How are we going to carry out Reconstruction? Then these other kinds of American principles, jostle for prominence over issues of freedom and equality. And so it's not a very satisfactory story. I think we all want to kind of come out of this with this idea that, after the Civil War, the Americans were like sort of purged of this great sin, right? And that's a narrative we hear a lot, but that's really an erroneous narrative. But if we pay attention to this more complicated narrative, I think it tells us a lot more about the reality of history and gives us a better sense of how we got where we are today.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if we got any questions from the audience. In the meantime, maybe talk to us a little bit about, you've done history in a number of different settings, right? You've been in the classroom, and then also in the presidential library is a really unique role, and sort of advancing into some of the hard conversations that we need to have that you were just lining out. Talk about sort of those different audiences and how that shapes the stories that you tell.
Yeah, well, I have really enjoyed, I've enjoyed being an academic historian, but I've really enjoyed working and directing a presidential library because Americans love presidents and they love to go to the presidential libraries, and it's such a great way to read, to sort of engage people in history, people who maybe don't want to read books. I know that's none of you, because you wouldn't be here tonight if you didn't like to read books, but there's so many people that are intimidated by books, but they'll love to come to a museum. And so being in a, overseeing a museum where people don't feel intimidated, where they feel like it's accessible, they can kind of come in and out, it's been a great way to tell stories, and not just Grant's story, but really the story of America and of a lot, everyday Americans as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I hesitate to ask because I know how long this book was in the works. But do you have any other ideas for stories that need telling?
Yes, so I'm going to, my next project that I've just started working on is going to be the story of Julia and Ulysses Grant and their experience with slave ownership. And Julia was from Missouri, another border state, and grew up in a slave-owning household, and sort of the way that they navigated that. As she was still, relying on enslaved laborers, as Grant was moving through Tennessee and Mississippi, emancipating slaves as he was, running his military operations. So I seem to be fascinated by these complicated stories of slavery and freedom in border areas during the Civil War era. So.
We have a number of questions begging to know more about the relationship with John Fee and Berea.
Oh, yes, that's fascinating. Cassius, by the early 1850s, had decided that he was still dedicated to really getting Kentuckians to think about overturning slavery, despite his lack of success in 1849 with the Constitutional Convention. And so he struck up this friendship with John Fee, who was a moral abolitionist, a Baptist minister, and got him to move to Madison County. Cassius gave him some of his, vast tracts of land in Madison County to settle on. And so eventually Fee starts a community and then a school that he calls Berea. And they have a really interesting relationship. So Clay picks Fee not because Clay is religious, because he's really not a religious adherent. He picks Fee because he thinks that this is the right place and the right person to take this message into the mountains where there are all these white Kentuckians that don't own slaves, and that this would be the place to really establish this foothold of anti-slavery. So they have this really interesting relationship. Clay defends Fee when all of these people are trying to attack the community. But they run into they sort of come to loggerheads over the course of the decade because Fee is much more abolitionist. He's willing to work outside the bounds of the Constitution. Clay tells him in letter after letter, we're doing this, the legal way. Do not talk to enslaved individuals. We don't do that. All of these things that Clay knew. For as brave and brash as he was, he knew. He had a very strong sense of where the line was, where white Kentuckians would be justified in attacking him. And so when Fee kind of goes outside of those lines, they break off, their contact. Now, later on, Fee comes back around. This is after the war. He tells Cassius not to divorce his wife. They're still, they don't completely break off their friendship. But it is interesting, I think, that, that Berea becomes this sort of bastion of racial equality for the second half of the 19th century. And that was only enabled by Cassius Clay. and giving that land, yeah.
I've got a couple of related questions that I'm going to merge with the permission of the askers. One about, we know that Clay continues to enslave people throughout the course of the institution. What do we know about him as an enslaver? And maybe what do we know about Mary Jane as a mistress of a slaveholding farm?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I didn't learn as much as I would have liked to have known about their actual interactions with their enslaved laborers. One of the things I do think is fascinating is that Clay when he's back from Russia, he comes back, as I mentioned, right at the time that Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and he celebrates this. Well, meanwhile, back in Kentucky, his wife has been trying to gather. They had rented out their enslaved laborers when they went off to Russia. And it took her over a year to kind of reclaim all of these people that she contracted these laborers out. And so she's working very hard because she needs their labor. And they essentially, even though the war has disrupted the order of things, even though Kentucky is exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation, as a loyal border state, they could have, right? They could have had manumitted these slaves and said sort of, well, the law is kind of, moribund at this point, but they didn't. And so there are enslaved laborers at Whitehall. Some of the men enlisted in the Union Army in 1864, but there were some enslaved laborers that were still there until the ratification of the 13th Amendment. So, we don't really have a sense, though, to that question of how, what kind of enslavers they were. We don't know.
Final question that I'll elaborate on a little bit asks, is Henry Clay related to Cassius Clay? I would expand that and say, what is the relationship politically between these two figures?
Yes, so they are related. Now, here's the interesting thing, and I was just talking to somebody about this beforehand. The genealogists are amazing these days. They can draw lines between anyone, but nobody's really teased out exactly how Henry Clay and Cassius Clay are related. They knew each other to be distant cousins, and no one's gotten more precise than that, and I'm really surprised about that, but that's where that is. Politically, it's really interesting. So when Cassius ends up having to defend himself the first time with his Bowie knife in 1843. This time he only maimed the guy. He only sliced out an ear and gouged an eye out. Didn't actually kill the guy this time. But the state of Kentucky charges him with inciting mayhem. So Henry volunteers to defend him in court, gets him acquitted because no Lexington jury could resist the charms or the rhetoric of Henry Clay. So then Henry Clay's political handlers decide to enlist Cassius to go campaign for him in 1844 during that presidential campaign. And that backfires royally. I talk about that in the book because he probably ends up costing Henry Clay the electoral votes of New York, which if Clay had gotten those, he would have been elected, and then we probably wouldn't have the Mexican-American War. So historians hate counterfactuals, but I just gave you one. So.
Well, in that case, thank you all for that really excellent question that prompted that. Thank you, Anne, for this wonderful book and being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It's delightful to be here.